Although client-side validation is something we always like to have, it's not always possible. Sometimes the value that you need to validate requires logic that executes against a database, or you need to make a web service call to a different domain. For those situations, MVC3 also supports remote validation. All you need to do is add a remote attribute onto a property. You're going to give that remote attribute a controller action to call and some additional parameters. And what jQuery validation will do for you is when it validates this username input, it will call back to the server at this location. You can return a true or false. Is this valid or not? And if you return a false and validation fails, jQuery will automatically display the error message for you. Inside of our time card model, the username property is a good candidate for remote validation because we're not going to be able to take all the usernames out of our database and send them to the client and say, here are the legal values to compare against, but we can take the username and send it to the server and perform a database query to see if it's valid. So let me add the remote attribute, and I'll need to specify the route name. We'll call this check username, and I'll copy this out so that I get the proper action name. I can also specify the specific controller as a second parameter. So I want to call check username on the home controller. And then there's additional name parameters that I can pass in, additional fields that I might need. I can customize the error message and say that username is invalid. I can also set the HTTP method. By default, this will be an HTTP GET operation. You could change that to a post if you needed it. So now that the attribute is in place, let's come over to the home controller and add that. All we need to do here is return some JSON. So I'll say that this returns some JSON. And we can expect that the username will be passed in as a parameter to us. By default, we'll say that we want to return a false value. And an important aspect here is to make sure if you're going to do an HTTP GET, to set JSON request behavior to allow GET. By default, it's set to deny GET to avoid any JSON hijacking. In here, we could perform a database query to see if this username is valid. I'm just going to do a quick check to say if username equals sallen, then the result is equal to true. Let's run the application, create a new time card, and I'll enter in sallen. That seemed to work. But what happens if I just enter the letter S? Username is invalid. Put sallen back in, and our remote validation seems to be working.